Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He's so happy that the SpongeBob Secret Lair crossover that Wizards just made affords fans of that lighthearted cartoon to have the ability to play goofy and silly spells by reskinning cards like Toxrill. Statistically, one of the top 10 saltiest commanders. It's Dana Roach. Hey, buddy.
It's been raining cats and dogs here all day today, but I'm fingers crossed here it doesn't start raining ducks and chickens, because that would be some real foul weather. And before the birds.
I totally. I'm glad that you're winging it here. Really, at the intros. And also, I do apologize. I did kind of give you a mouthful of an intro there. You did as well. Yeah. But I had some feelings. Some choices were made. You know, as Tatiana says, choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
But we've got a proper topic that we want to get into. And Dana, I'm really, really excited to discuss this with you. What are we talking about in this show?
We're talking about safety blankets and vestigial cards. Cards that you have to kind of grow out of or let go, or your deck has kind of moved away from and you've forgotten are part of your deck and why they were once there.
Exactly. This episode's all about those things that we had to grow up from or grow out of. I'm very delighted to get into this one with you, but we've got a couple of shout outs to get to before we get into it.
First things first, we're excited to be teamed with Dragon Shield. Their sleeves come in dozens of colors and art variants, and their sleeve crafter tool at dragonshield.com is excellent. It lets you design personalized sleeves for Magic collection and things that match your deck if you're so inclined. And if you were at MagicCon Chicago, you might have gotten a chance to see our personalized EDHRECast sleeves, or maybe even have gotten a box yourself at the EDHRECast live event. If you click on the link in the description below, you get 5% off any Dragon Shield product. It makes your purchase cheaper and it supports the show. Don't let your hand get wheeled. Protect your deck with Dragon Shield.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to those sleeves becoming available on the Dragon Shield site in the coming weeks.
Yes.
I love the design on those so much. Also, you can support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. As a thank you to our patrons, we have tons of perks like our patron-only Discord, early access, and more. There are, of course, free ways to show your love for the show. Throw us a like, leave a review. It really does mean a whole lot. And hey, we've seen the numbers. Challenge the stats here. Only like half of regular viewers are subscribed, so consider hitting that big red button too. And by the way, if you listen to this show on a podcast app, make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes apps and feeds get finicky. I know I've had to resubscribe to shows I liked before after some updates have happened and stuff like that. So sometimes it's just helpful to do a double check that you're actually subscribed and the shows you like are downloading the way you want them to and all that. And finally, a special thank you to our patron shout out of the week, Maurice Weber. Maurice, you're the heckin' coolest. Thank you.
And EDHREC has started doing a weekly interview show called What's Zup, hosted by writer Andy Zupke at twitch.tv/EDHRECast on Tuesdays at 7 Pacific and 10 Eastern. And the next guest Tuesday after this show will be altar artist extraordinaire Eric Klug. Ooh. So stop in to see Klug talk about the ridiculous altars he does. He was in Chicago and I got to look at this Joker altar he did. It's unbelievable the level of detail he puts into these cards. It's absurd.
That is going to be such a fantastic interview. Klug does such amazing work. Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern. Definitely give that one a look. Well, Dana, let's get into our topic here. We're talking about some safety blankets and, as you've dubbed them, vestigial cards. Cards that maybe your deck doesn't need anymore, or maybe that you as a player don't need anymore for various reasons. And I think in the first half of the show, we're going to start off with some of those safety blanket cards that make me feel good, but I maybe don't need them the way that I think I used to need them. And the first example that I'd like to start off with is actually Lightning Greaves. This is one that I used to play a whole lot, but it has gone down a little bit over time. And I have a particular example that I want to share with. But before I even get into an example, how do you feel about the Lightning Greaves?
No, this is kind of a perfect example. So you can talk about cards where maybe they're not as good as they once were, so you don't use them. Like Phyrexian Arena is kind of that example where you spend 3 mana, you draw your first card the next turn, and compared to just casting a Night's Whisper or one of those many variants, it takes a lot of turns to get there, to get your value out of a Phyrexian Arena. So maybe the game has moved past that card. This isn't really that. It's maybe that your game play style has just changed how it affects your deck or something. And I think Lightning Greaves is a great example of that. Once upon a time, it was a kind of card that I put in all of my decks because the thought process was, I had to protect my commander. And this is the best way to do that. I will have these Greaves that I can keep this really important piece safe. And I then got in the habit of adding it to decks, kind of without thinking about whether or not, number one, the commander needed to be protected, and number two, it was actually doing that job.
Right. Yeah. And I have a particular example that called it to mind for me for this episode, is that I used to have this in my Sir Conrad deck, because Conrad is a lightning rod for removal. The amount of damage output that Conrad is capable of means everyone wants to get rid of Conrad. And based off of a lot of prior experience of seeing Lightning Greaves all over the place, playing it in a whole bunch of my decks, I got it in my mind that the haste I didn't need to care about as much as like protect from a path to exile type of deal. But as I kept playing my Conrad deck and as I kept tuning up my Conrad deck, over time I noticed that the play pattern of that deck meant that the turn I play Conrad is like the big turn, and that since everyone is like gunning to remove Conrad immediately, they're saving their removal for him. So even if I went to equip the Greaves, they would just path to exile him or Swords of Plowshares him in response. So it's just like, all right, so that didn't actually do the thing that I want to do. So why not just play him and go for the big move rather than play him, try to equip, and it may not work after all. Right. That one big turn aspect of that particular deck and that gameplay kind of revealed to me that like, oh, maybe I don't need Lightning Greaves here the way that I might need it in some other decks.
And Lightning Greaves is a good piece of protection in a situation where like you are protecting a thing that maybe then becomes a threat, or that the threat isn't immediate apparent.
Yes.
Whereas with Conrad, people know, oh, Conrad's in the command zone. Conrad's going to come out.
Yeah.
And there's Lightning Greaves in play. I'm going to need to respond to that before the Greaves are equipped. Everything that's happening is visible and can be seen. And when it comes to protecting your creature, letting everyone see what you're doing particularly in the way the game is played today, doesn't work necessarily. And you're not using the haste. So the two things the card does, it's not really doing for you in that deck.
Yes, Lightning Greaves still shows up in 25% of decks that are eligible to play it, and for a good reason. It's showing up in commanders like Kalia, where the haste and the shroud are both very, very important. But some of the decks that I play do not fit both of those descriptions. And yeah, as you mentioned, Conrad, he's not sticking around for multiple turns. No one will suffer him to live. You can hope that he stays on the field to stick around for multiple, like Tombstone Stairwell, creation of zombies and killing all the creatures and dealing damage. You can hope that he sticks around for a bunch of Mesmeric Orb Mill and a bunch of death triggers and things like that. But more often, I just found better success in setting up a big graveyard for him, or a field of creatures that are like primed to die, and then I just have a problem board in the first place, so that when he enters I can just immediately deal some nuclear damage right away, and the protection is not really quite as necessary. And I can't be the only person out there who's encountered this experience with Lightning Greaves. Yeah,
like sometimes you find yourself in a position where you're better off with, like, essentially you're talking mono black with Conrad, maybe a Feign Death, a card where you can cast it in response to removal.
Yes.
Instead of equipping Lightning Greaves and someone removes your creature in response, you just do your thing, and when someone goes to remove your Conrad, then you save your Conrad in response. A lot of times being able to inverse how you're protecting your commander, where you're responding versus giving someone the response, is a better way to play that.
High key, having a sacrifice outlet in play and a Malakir Rebirth type of effect to be able to be like, all right, cool, I'll Malakir Rebirth my commander and then sacrifice him and he'll pop right back and your spell fizzles because the target is no longer valid. That has proven to me to be a much better and more sophisticated version of protecting my commander than using something like a Greaves. This isn't going to be the case for every single deck out there, but it does strike me as Lightning Greaves used to be like the king of protection.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily in that state for all decks anymore. And that's an important thing for us to like reckon with, come to terms with, so that we can find better types of protection, or just go full throttle if that's what the deck really wants to actually have happen.
It's still a good card. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we're not arguing that it's not. I use it in my Asperia Supreme Judge deck. It's a Sphinx deck, so there's 20 Sphinxes in there, but I'm not using it to save my commander. I'm using it because there's a lot of times in the game where like people don't see what I'm going to play. Like, I'm not worried about them hitting Asperia. I want to be able to drop a Sphinx that's a 6/6 out of the blue, and then put Greaves on it, and then follow that up with like something that gives a double strike or whatever. So I can deal a bunch of damage out of nowhere, or get an extra turn off Meta My the Ageless or something and turn it into two doubles. Right. But like, people can't see that coming. Whereas if you're protecting your commander, it's much easier for them to respond to, and it's gotten less effective in that regard. And you just don't need it, like you said. It's just not something that you need for that thing anymore necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really big example. But I think there are also probably some non-basic lands that are kind of quintessential, quote, safety blanket cards as well. And Dana, this is where you and I are going to have a difficult conversation about the Reliquary Tower.
Sure. I mean, like, Reliquary Tower is one of those... I'm not going to argue that anyone needs Reliquary Tower in their deck. Because you don't. There's almost no situation where like it's better than the card you'd be running in that slot instead of it. I'm running it because it feels good. It's a nice little, like it is the quintessential safety blanket card.
Yeah.
I can keep all of my cards. That feels so nice. I don't have to discard, in a deck that doesn't care about discarding. Like, oh, I can hold everything. That feels awesome. That's all it is though. It just feels awesome. That's it.
I get it. I understand it. Well, so I half get it. Maybe I shouldn't say I completely understand it because I play a lot of graveyard stuff and I take advantage of having to discard to hand size constantly.
Sure.
I can't wait to discard an 8-drop into my graveyard so I can cheat it out by paying less mana. That's my favorite thing. But not everyone plays the way that I do. So Reliquary Tower looks a lot more appealing when you're not doing silly graveyard stuff the way that I am. But even then, the best 7 cards is probably still good enough compared to like the 9 cards. Like you don't need to always keep the 9. I get that keeping 9 cards in hand feels nice. And also, frankly, some strategies out there definitely care about having a lot of stuff in their hands.
Sure.
I have played an Elegith deck in the past where the whole point was to play cards like Imperial Plate, I think was one of them, that buffs your creatures up for the number of cards in your hand. So like there are still strategies that really, really want to take advantage of Reliquary Tower. There is a reason that it's still showing up in 30% of decks that are eligible to play it, which is all decks.
Yeah.
It's a popular land. I'm just saying that sometimes that colorless land do be messing up my mana curve a little bit and my color fixing, and that has burned me before. Yeah. And that is a thing, that is a cost to weigh, and we should weigh it properly.
And I think Reliquary Tower is one of those cards where, as old-timey, at this point, you've been playing a long time too, Joey. But like, if you were to go back to when you built your first Commander deck and to look at the amount of utility lands that were available, Reliquary Tower was kind of an easy choice to make because there was only a handful of like really decent colorless utility lands you could be running in your deck. Well,
right.
It's much easier to include then when there's no competition. Yeah. There's so much competition in that slot today. And I think some of this stuff that we still do is a situation where, like, particularly if you've been playing a long time, you don't think in terms of the game today, you think in terms of the game as it was when you first started using that card.
We learned a specific thing, and so it's easy to hold on to that still being the case, but it may not be the case anymore. And utility lands in general, you're right, that is a crowded field out there right now. In addition to like the mana fixing that you have available on your lands. Right. And so it is easier than ever to not have as many basic lands in your deck. Which is a problem that I know you have constantly, where you play 4 basic lands in a deck or something like that. But
I did just build a deck with 32 basics in it.
I'm so proud of you. Is it monocolor?
Yeah, it is not. It is a 2-color deck.
I'm even more proud of you. I thought you were like maybe cheating on me.
Jorn, God of Winter, and I have to have them all be snowlands so I can untap them with Jorn's ability.
Okay, see, there you go, right? There are ways that basics are important. When someone casts a Settle the Wreckage on you, it feels nice to actually get some basic lands from that.
Right. Versus like, well, I found one.
Yes, exactly. You don't want to like, all right, fail to find when someone hits my creature with a Path to Exile. Feels a little bit awkward. So like prioritizing basics is important these days. That is a thing that we should, at the very least, be conscious about. Yes. And so playing too many utility lands isn't something we should do willy-nilly, and the field is crowded, and Reliquary Tower, to me, has not always felt quite as necessary, because it does feel nice to keep, some extra cards in hand, but my best 7 is also usually good enough, so it hasn't always felt necessary, and if I can get a little bit more percentage by having the right color fixing, sometimes that won't burn me in certain ways, which I find important.
I think Command Beacon is another utility land that kind of falls into this category as well.
For sure.
Number one, it's maybe not as old as Reliquary Tower, but it's an older land, too, so this is also coming from a time when there's a lot less competition. And at the time when you're looking at Command Beacon, it lets me save my command tax on this commander. That's really, really useful in this deck. I'm recasting this commander oftentimes 4 or 5 times a game. Well, not only is there more competition today, once in a while you'll hit a game where like you're casting your commander that much, but the game really doesn't necessarily work that way anymore. At least in my experience, even the games that go 10 turns, you're just not casting your commander 3 times. That's a rarity, I think, in Commander versus how maybe it played 5, 6, 7 years ago.
I once upon a time had this in nearly all of my decks, like right after it hit, I think, the Commander Legends reprints, because it was like the first time I got a proper reprint and I was so excited. And I cannot recall the last time I activated a Command Beacon. But I can remember the times where that freaking colorless mana messed up my curve and my color fixing. Because again, too many utility lands does have a downside. I think I have it in one deck now, which is a deck that specifically plays around with lands a whole lot. But even then, I'm still just like, I don't remember the last time this happened.
Yeah.
So in that case, how necessary is it? Even though the text looks appealing, it looks really good. And it makes me feel like, oh, I would save plenty of mana on this. I don't know that it's actually happened for me. So then why am I planning around a contingency for a thing that doesn't actually need to occur? Kind of deal? Yeah.
A lot of these utility lands, and we probably could talk about 5 or 6 more in this conversation, but there's a bunch of these where, like, once upon a time, your thought process was, well, there's no reason not to run it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I can afford to put some utility lands in here. And even if I use this one, once every 15 games, there's not much downside to it, assuming your color fixing is taken care of. Well, there is a cost today. The reason not to run it is there's something better. Because there's just so many good utility lands.
Yeah.
That's kind of the true cost here, assuming you've figured out your color fixing. You have to put that Reliquary Tower, that Command Beacon in the slot of something else that might actually be consistently game impacting.
To an extent, I feel a little bit this way about the problem of having too many MDFC lands in your deck too.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them enter tapped, or they cost 3 life to enter untapped on their back half. And that can be either a hit to your tempo or you're paying kind of a lot of life. And Dana, I know you like to pay life to draw cards.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you don't always need to pay life to get like just some straight up mana.
Right.
And the MDFC lands, a lot of those do feel like really great backup cards to have in case the game goes long or something like that. Like, oh, here's a thing that isn't just a dead draw later on. But over a certain threshold of them, I think that does start to actually have a material impact on your early game plays. And that is the type of thing where it'd be like, let me make sure that I'm measuring this out more carefully,
yeah.
I guess. There's
2 things I look at when it comes to MDFCs in a deck. Number one, I feel like you have to have the discipline to think of them as a tapped land most of the time and play them when you're like, I need to play land this turn. I'm going to play this as a tapped land, even though I'd love to hold on to it till later, but you have to force yourself to just play it and bite the bullet. Then when you do that, then you have to get into your head that, okay, since I'm going to do that, I am going to have to play them as land sometimes. How much is this going to hit my tempo because I'm running a bunch of these in a deck?
Right.
In addition to maybe some other lands that come into play tap for various reasons, a Theros Scry Temple or something. So those are the things you have to make sure, number one, you have the discipline to play them correctly. And number two, once you do that, make sure you're not impacting your deck by running, 5 or 6 of them in a deck that already has 3 or 4 ETB tapped lands. And then you're looking at a third of your lands coming to play tapped, and that will make a difference.
Yes. Yeah. For the record, this part of the show will probably result in me having a fight with one of our Discord moderators, Angelo, who loves MDFC lands a whole lot. To me, just those possible backup late game spells do come at a tempo cost that I just want to be more proactive about balancing and not take for granted. Because they do feel like, oh, what a nice thing to have in my back pocket.
Sure.
But then what about your front pocket,
Right. And maybe if you're playing in a bracket 1 or bracket 2 even, you can afford to have a dozen lands coming into play tapped, and that's not going to probably impact your deck too badly. I believe that. That's probably a situation. But if you're talking about the 3 bracket, then things get a little sketchier. Where like, can you afford to be 1 mana behind consistently, a third of the time? That's a whole different thing, particularly when you're going to have situations where you're not casting them at spells at all.
Yeah.
All you're doing that entire game is playing them as tapped lands, and you've never found an opportunity to use the spell portion of it. So it's just been all downside.
Yeah, I think at max I run 4 in one of my decks, and I would be a little hesitant to run more than 4 MDFCs in a deck. But that's my personal threshold.
Mine's roughly the same. So you're not the only person that looks at it that way.
There you go. Cool. The specific effects that they have are also what you need to pay even more attention to.
Yeah.
I think none of the 3 of us enjoyed the card Fel the Profane when it was first revealed quite as much as we loved some of the other new options from Modern Horizons. Because Fel the Profane, here's a removal spell, but it's 4 mana, and it felt like actually quite a sizable cost compared to some of the other ones. Like, we championed Sundering Eruption real fast out the gate because that one late game felt more unique I guess, in its way. And so maybe that's what I find myself leaning into with them. The ones that I choose that are MDFC lands, their abilities are unique enough that if I do need that effect, it's going to be a blowout. That's why I like Balagate Recovery. Late game, that actually can be quite a sizable impact. This is me just kind of rhapsodizing. Basically, watch out for your utility lands. The whole point of this early segment of the show is that, like, they feel good to play, but in game, they might be holding you back in small, sometimes even imperceptible ways.
Yes. A lot of it's about kind of seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Whether it's talking about things like Lightning Greaves that maybe is still a good card, but doesn't quite function the way you once thought it did, or some of these utility lands that you once looked at it from the point of view of like, well, why not? There's no downside to it. Well, there is nowadays. Similarly with MDFCs, you run them and like, well, I had the potential later on to do something. Well, you do, but there's a cost to that, and you should be aware of like how that's going to impact how your deck plays holistically.
100%. Dana, you've written down a really interesting one here as a potential other safety blanket card. You're talking about propaganda effects is something you've written down, and I want to pick your brain about this. What are your intentions with my daughter? What are you talking about here?
So this is this feels a little bit like Lightning Greaves in that how the game plays today is a little bit different than how it played 6-7 years ago, and back then, you could have your Lightning Greaves on board and plan to put them on your commander to protect your commander, and often enough that would work. Similarly with propaganda, I can play this propaganda. I'm going to not get attacked, or people aren't going to be able to afford to attack me all out, and I can do my thing. Today, people will remove your Lightning Greaves when you go to equip them to your commander much more frequently than they once did, meaning it's not going to protect your commander. Similarly, people will remove that propaganda in a way they didn't used to, and you've left yourself wide open.
Okay.
Because it's on the board. Now, a fog is a different story. People don't know it's there. But when people can see your propaganda, and they can then plan around dealing with it in a way they can't with something that's in your hand. And I think that's a thing that's changed a little bit. I'm not saying propaganda is not a good card. I have it in one deck still. But it plays differently today than it once did because people are more proactive in how they respond to problems, and just in general, people are better players, I think, or like they're looking at the game over the course of multiple turns and planning things out in a way they did much less of years ago.
I love your explanation there, and I really do think I'm picking up what you're putting down, I guess, because, I mean, looking at the numbers, Propaganda and Ghostly Prison still show up in 12 and 11% of decks that are able to play them, and a lot of those decks do take the form of, like a Queen Marchesa I'm seeing here. Makes total sense. You want to keep that monarchy, or some particularly irksome commanders. I'm seeing Nikasar the Mind Reaser, for instance, here, who is like, people are going to want to hit you. So having some early stuff to buffer that away does make sense. But your point about relying on it a little bit too much is a place where, these cards could burn you. If you tap out or something like that, leave yourself thinking that Propaganda is a good enough defense. It may not be when someone puts down a Lorna the Third Path or a Reclamation Sage, and then is able to just, all right, cool, now I can all out hit you. Whereas now that we have especially so many more sophisticated fogs that give you such huge upside, which we've seen more and more of over the years, those surprises are way more impactful.
The other angle to this is a little bit like Lightning Greaves as well. Do you actually need to protect yourself? I think years ago, I defaulted to this thought process that, okay, I had to have some way to keep people from attacking me. Maybe I'd be better served just removing them from the game with something offensively than protect myself. And a similar thing occurred. I have a mono red deck, Agnes the Dragon's Lash. It's a Jund deck, but I played as mono red. And for the first couple months I played it, I ran the card Glacial Crevices and I ran Sunstone, which are, I had all snowlands in the deck, so they were away in mono red. They're a fog effect basically in mono red. I could sacrifice a snowland to fog people for the turn. And I'm like, okay, well, this is a very aggressive deck. I'm going to be attacking a lot, not going to have blockers, so it's nice to have this as a fog effect to protect myself. What I discovered was I didn't really need to play defense because I was playing so aggressively that, like, if it got to the point where I was having to worry about playing defense, I was probably losing the game anyway. And I think there's an element of that with propaganda sometimes where you're like, okay, I need to protect myself. Do you? Or are you better off just going so offensively that people aren't in a position to worry about, like, dealing with you in a way that propaganda would solve?
Interesting. I have some mixed feelings on that. I think a thing that I'm aware of is the the fog effects that you just named in mono red are a little bit different to some of my favorite fogs, which are like, the Ink Shield or Arachnogenesis varieties.
Sure. And you can see those ones coming. The ones I mentioned, these red ones are also ones
that too
that people can respond to. So
yes.
That's different. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's possible that on this, it's going to be different colors have different relationships to these types of effects.
Yeah.
My husband is currently playing a Aragorn Monarch deck, which he's wickedly good with. Actually, he picked that up way fast, and it's not frustrating at all. I promise. Love you, babe. He enjoys those ghostly prisons, but he learned very quickly not to rely on them, especially because some of the punching power of that deck is in the deflecting palm style cards.
Sure.
Is in the, all right, settle the wreckage. Oh, now your board is open and I can completely demolish you. So having a nice balance of learning what to rely on, but not to rely on them too much. We are not saying they're bad cards, as you have already stated.
Yeah.
But it is more about the gameplay that they could encourage within you. And a good habit when you have those cards in play is not to think that they're enough of a shield that you can take the rest shields down. You should still probably have a little bit of shields up when you need it, even if you have one of these cards in play. That's the lesson I think is most important about learning here.
Mm-hmm.
Another quick one that I'll point out here, Maskwood Nexus, which I think has some similar vibes to what you just named. Maskwood Nexus is that 4-mana artifact that turns all of your creatures into changelings. Every one of your creatures is going to have all of the creature types. Mm-hmm. Now, to be clear, again, there are some decks where I totally get why Maskwood Nexus is being played here.
Sure.
Disa is a Lurgoyf Jund deck, for instance, and her milling creatures that the Nexus has turned into Lurgoyfs from right within your library, so then she cheats them into play for free. Aces. Atla Palani turning all of your dinosaurs into their also eggs. So then if a board wipe happens, she will reset your board for you. Clever. I love that. But the general Kindred deck does not need a Maskwood Nexus. Mm-hmm. Like 64% of Rin and Seri decks playing Maskwood Nexus is kind of wild to me. I have a Rin and Seri deck in my family meta, and it just already plays a whole lot of changelings. And I think that's also kind of the case for like the party precon with Barakos as your leader. I guess I just don't think that getting a party set up is really that hard. And the payoff for having a full party isn't so great that you couldn't just play another creature in that card slot instead. This card is solving a problem you don't necessarily have in lots of those creature type focused decks. I guess to end my tirade here, why are 9% of Sauron decks playing Maskwood Nexus? Why are 8% of Ur-Dragon decks playing Maskwood Nexus? That's crazy pants to me. Anyway, sorry. I'll get off my high horse now.
Well, I think this is something that comes up a little bit with stuff like Chromatic Lantern.
Yeah. Ooh, I was wondering if we'd get to that.
I need the color fixing from Chromatic Lantern. And you did maybe 6 or 7 years ago when the amount of dual lands that were available, there was 6 less cycles than there is today or something. And you didn't have as many like random creatures or enchantments to let you, cast spells as if the mana were of any color or whatever. And we didn't have treasures like we have them today.
Yeah.
Chromatic Lantern, I would have once upon a time absolutely put into every single 3-color deck, 3 or 4 or 5-color deck. The game has changed around that card. And even though it's a safety blanket that like once upon a time made sense to put into all of your decks, the world doesn't really look that way anymore. And it's probably not doing what it once did.
Yeah. I will, for the record, give a big pass to Chromatic Lantern just because sometimes I enjoy playing a little bit on the easy mode of like,
absolutely,
I've got this. And it's nice to not have to worry necessarily about like, do we have my exact colors?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a nice vibe to be at.
Absolutely.
But if you are trying to like gain more percentage points in like how effective your deck is, it is the type of card that you can totally leave behind. And in fact, probably should leave behind to make sure that your deck is like tuned up if you're moving in to those upgraded and optimized spaces for sure.
Yep.
I do enjoy, I've got a deck that uses it, I think, in a strategic way. I have a Yannette Cryptic Sovereign deck where I'm playing a lot of fetch lands to be able to shuffle my library more regularly because Yannette cares about putting stuff back on top of your deck, and being able to shuffle those away is useful. But then later in the game, if I have those fetch lands, I don't always want to pay life for every single one that I draw. And I might not always want to shuffle my library at the times that I draw them. So Chromatic Lantern actually turns them into the ability to tap for mana. Mm-hmm. So like there are strategic ways to unlock it too, but I think that's the only deck where I'm still playing it, where I can like justify that. And outside of that, it is more of a comfort food card than it is a strategically optimized card. So I definitely see your point.
I have a deck running a bunch of Pestilence effects, and Chromatic Lantern lets me turn all of the white mana into black mana to pump it into Pestilence. Mm-hmm. So again, like Lightning Greaves has maybe kind of, it's not that it's not a good card, it's just, it's changed how it gets used in the deck. Chromatic Lantern is kind of the same thing. The things I'm using it for aren't the same as they once were.
Yeah, I totally feel you. Well, Dana, speaking of cards and how they get used, how about we move now to challenge the stats? Because there's a whole lot of data on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with all of it. So let's apply some critical thinking to those statistics and give them a bit of a challenge.
One of my favorite things about Magic the Gathering is how it can take you anywhere. Every player has a favorite plane, Ravnica, Innistrad, or Tarkir. It's hard to pick just one, but my favorite plane is the one that takes me to the next Magic event. While I'm traveling, one thing I always make sure to pack, besides my decks, is my everyday earbuds by Raycon. Their latest model is better than ever with a whopping 32-hour battery life. Even with flight delays or long walks to event halls, I can count on high-quality sound the entire trip. Everyday earbuds also feature the best active noise cancellation around, able to beat out even crying babies on the flight to make sure you get a restful flight before the event. And no matter what piece of the color pie you prefer, Raycon has a color for you, like forest green for all you fellow Selesnya players. Even if your decks are built on a budget, you can still get a pair of Raycon everyday earbuds since they're just half the price of other premium audio brands with similar features. They even come with a 30-day happiness guarantee, so you can return them with no questions asked. That's like your LGS having a return policy on booster packs. You just can't beat that. So whether I'm at home, working out, or on my way to my next con, I always make sure to keep the Raycon everyday earbuds packed and ready to go. Here's what you got to do to get a pair of your own. Head to buyraycon.com/EDH, and not only will you get the best earbuds for 20% off, but you'll be supporting the channel at the same time. That's right, you'll get 20% off when you go to buyraycon.com/EDH. Go to buyraycon.com/EDH to get 20% off the best-selling everyday earbuds, brought to you by Raycon.
This episode is also brought to you by Spellify. Spellify is a hilarious magic card guessing game over on the website Commander's Herald. This game shows you a card but with all the text and art removed, and you can guess letters to fill in the blanks to try and identify what that card is. Think of it like Wordle, but with magic cards. See if you can guess the card by using as few letters as possible, just by recognizing how many letters are in its name or based on its activation costs and things like that, or see if you can guess it by not filling in any blanks at all. Real power move right there. There's even a Spellify hard mode for those extra daring aficionados out there. And of course, whenever you're done playing, Spellify's host site, Commander's Herald, is a great place to catch up on some of the spicy magic news of the day too. I know a lot of big names in Magic have been having a blast guessing the card of the day, so if you want to join in and have a little fun while you do, enjoy testing out your magic prowess over on Spellify.
So my challenge this week is for the card Selective Obliteration, a card that when I mentioned it to Joey before the show, he wasn't sure was actually a real card.
Yep. Didn't believe you.
Selective Obliteration costs 3 and 2 colorless, so you actually have to have the ability to produce colorless mana to cast this card. And it says, each player chooses a color, then exile each permanent unless it's colorless or it's only the color its controller chose. It's currently in about 14,000 decks in EDHREC. It should see more play, especially in colorless or mono green or mono blue decks, because they lack board wipes, especially in green and blue. But really in any monocolor deck, this is a card that just doesn't touch your stuff. You will choose whatever color you're playing. None of your stuff gets sacrificed. And sure, maybe someone else is playing a monocolor deck too, but monocolor gets played less than 2 color decks, and there's a lot of 3, 4, 5s out there. Very often this is going to wipe out half of all of your opponent's boards while not touching you in monocolors. It's an exile effect, so it gets around indestructible stuff like that. It's just a devastating spell in monocolor decks, particularly in colors like mono green and mono blue that really don't have many options, and it just should see more play.
On a scale of like vanilla grizzly bears to Chains of Mephistopheles, this card is somewhere around the Dead Ringers area of, I keep rereading it and I'm like not entirely sure what it does, but as I finally understand it, yeah, this is really going to give a lot of your opponent's multicolored commanders a problem. Yeah. And I do kind of like it for that, especially in the specific areas that you mentioned. Like there are colors that don't need this type of effect. The removal is sophisticated enough. That's actually, once I first like grokked what the card actually does, it reminded me of Renounce the Guilds or Ravnica at War, which are white spells that get rid of multicolored stuff. And that's what this card will do too, but white doesn't need that effect. White has so many other types of removal already. But as you noted, mass removal in green, blue, and especially of course in colorless, it's a little less sophisticated, so you could use a little bit more help.
Yeah, the fact that it's just never going to touch your stuff in a monocolor deck or a colorless deck, it's just a really good piece of tech to not hurt you and hurt almost all of your opponents. So, and it's a cheap card. It's 50 cents.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'll move to our listener challenge the stats of the week. And our listener submitted challenge the stats this week comes to us from Arya in our patron Discord, who has a challenge for Aminatu Veil Piercer. As a reminder, that is the new Aminatu, the legendary Esper creature who surveils 2 on your turn and can miracle out your enchantments if they are the first card that you draw each turn. Arya mentions that sagas in general feel like a pretty underrepresented theme on Aminatu's EDHREC page, but especially the card Vault 12 the Necropolis from the Fallout set, which currently shows up in only 27 total of the 8,621 Aminatu decks out there. And before I mention the specific effects on that card, Arya has some razor-sharp reasoning that I gotta get to first. Since the standard place for a miracle to trigger is in your draw step, you're often getting the first 2 chapters on a saga as soon as Aminatu miracles it out. Saga chapters go up after your draw step. So if you miracle a saga out on your own turn, it enters, you'll do chapter 1, and then immediately you will get to do chapter 2. So for Arya's suggestion here of the card Vault 12, this is huge because that saga is so much more powerful when there is as little time as possible between chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 gives every player 3 rad counters, and then chapter 2 creates zombie mutant tokens for each rad counter that players have. Traditionally, if you just cast this on your main phase and gave people counters, those counters would probably get reduced on those players' own turns. But with this synergy, if you miracle it, which is Aminatu's whole deal, you instead have no reduction of the rad counters, and you immediately make 12 zombie tokens for 2 total mana. Oh, and then chapter 3 puts 2 +1 counters on each of them, so then they'll attack for like 48 damage on the next turn. Arya, this is amazing. This is so awesome and way too cool to only show up in 27 total of Aminatu's 8,000 plus decks out there. Other patrons in our Discord were commenting on how cool this is too, and we are delighted to share it with all of you out there. Arya, thank you again for sharing such a cool underplayed synergy.
I love those kind of cards where you just like, once you see it, it's obvious, but it's also really obvious why it was easy to miss in the first place.
Yeah, what a cool bit.
Yeah. Well, Challenge of Stats has been brought to you by Cardsphere, the best way to turn your unplayed cards into played cards. I just put together a deck I mentioned earlier, Jorn, God of Winter, and I would bet half the cards for this deck came from Cardsphere. You could just do what I do and send out cards you don't need for credit towards cards you do want, or simply just deposit credit directly into your account, and users will send you the cards you want straight to your mailbox. Go to cardsphere.com and check out our favorite way to build up decks.
Okay, Dana. So we had mentioned some safety blanket cards earlier in the episode, but you had also thrown out this idea of vestigial cards. And I'd love for you to elaborate on what you mean by that, because it sounds kind of gross.
So I have the perfect example of this that I came across last week or so. I'm not sure when the episode is going to air, but like we did standalone episodes talking about our decks and where they rank on the new bracket system. I recorded mine last, and I'm not sure if it's aired yet, but one of my decks, I have an old Edric's Master of Trest deck, and I was looking through my list as I was doing the recording, and I noticed the card Crop Rotation was in my deck. Sacrifice a land to go get a land to put it into play. And Crop Rotation is in that deck specifically to go get Gaia's Cradle. Edric is an aggressive deck filled with like 1-drops. I'm training them out as fast as I can, so like being able to go grab Gaia's Cradle for 1 mana and then tap it for 6 or 7 or 10 or whatever it is was really powerful. The thing is, I sold my Gaia's Cradle sometime around 2021. My son had wanted a nice trombone for something for school, and I'm like, I don't play this deck very often. I'm going to get rid of that Gaia's Cradle.
Okay.
But there was still a Crop Rotation in the deck, despite the fact that there's really no land that I need to go get that's worth having a slot devoted to just go getting that land. There's nothing that was nearly impactful enough to go get like Gaia's Cradle. So I have a card sitting in that deck for years that wasn't really doing anything because something had changed and its purpose had ceased to exist. It is the appendix, the human appendix of that deck. It was what probably once served a purpose, but it no longer did.
That's amazing. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh too much at your pain here, Dana. I don't mean for the schadenfreude to be too great, but that's really funny, bro.
That's the perfect illustration of what we're going to talk about here is the cards that you have in your deck that once did a thing, and then as you've added cards or removed cards or whatever, it maybe no longer is necessary because that purpose is gone. I doubt the example will be nearly as stark as the one I just gave, but like that is a thing that happens in decks sometimes.
Yeah, it becomes functionless over the course of evolution. So I feel you on that. And this is, I would say, to call to mind a more immediate, kind of recent thing with the zombie Aetherdrift precon that just came out. I'm sorry, Dana, what is that? I'm sorry, is that a jug of water? Is that an entire jug?
It is a gallon jug of water.
Okay, sorry. I people sometimes give me grief because I drink out of a mason jar here, and it's a pretty big mason jar. And people are like, "Whoa, Joey, that's a whole lot." But you have an entire jug of water, and that could not go uncommented upon.
I'm trying to stay very, very hydrated.
Wow. All right, stay thirsty, everyone. So a recent zombie Aetherdrift precon, where was I with that? Yeah, the new Temet deck. That's a really cool Esper zombie deck that a lot of people are enjoying right now. But I would wager that players who are used to zombie decks and lots of zombie lords in zombie decks, like Cemetery Reaper and friends, will kind of experience a bit of a rude awakening with the new Temet commander. Like, the average Will Health zombie deck, for example, contains 10 zombie lord cards that pump up all of your creatures. But the thing is, with the new Temet, he already pumps up all of your zombies on his own. So you have a lot less need of all of those traditional zombie lords. But I bet it will be pretty hard to separate from them because we are so used to those effects in zombie decks being so clutch. But they are, in a way, a little bit of that vestigial thing. Like, you don't actually need these quite as much as you may have used to in other types of decks. And that can be a bit of a hard adjustment. Yeah,
a similar one I ran into is I have a Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, and Agent of the Iron Throne deck that's an Aristocrats deck.
Okay.
And it's filled with Eldrazi spawns and scions. So that I can sacrifice those, and then Agent of the Iron Throne deals damage when a creature you control dies. So I have a bunch of Aristocrat enchantment kind of effects in that deck. When I first brewed it, I put in a High Market and Phyrexian Tower and all of the lands that are sacrifice outlets, like you do in an Aristocrats deck very often.
Oh, High Market.
Right. Except I'm running a bunch of spawns and scions that self-sacrifice. And it took me several months to realize I really wasn't using those because my stuff I already had sack outlets based on the creatures. And then my thought process was, okay, but I'm making a few, the spawns and scions are being produced by an Eldrazi, and okay, yes, I can sacrifice the spawns and scions, but maybe I also want to sacrifice that, the Eldrazi that actually produced them. But that's one trigger from one land.
Yeah.
How often is that relevant compared to something else I could run in that slot? For example, Shifting Woodlands, that lets me make it a copy of something in my graveyard.
Oh, that card's so good.
And maybe I will make Shifting Woodlands a copy of the Meathook Massacre in my graveyard to give me a second Aristocrat effect. That is a much more effective use of that utility land slot than a single sack outlet that's going to give me one extra sacrifice effect for one extra round of damage. But I had it in my head that because I was playing an Aristocrats deck, I wanted all of these sack outlets. And it took me a while to realize I just didn't.
Dang. I mean, to be fair, that is a pretty unique version of an Aristocrats deck.
Yes, for sure.
Because the creatures do enable sacrifice on their own. But yeah, I would have the exact same pattern or same trajectory, same path to follow down, I think. Just it's Aristocrats, therefore these are the lanes that you play. Not always true.
Yeah.
Not always true. And that is a hard lesson to learn.
It's similar to my commander is very important. I'm going to start off by putting Lightning Greaves in the deck. It's that same kind of automatic response you do because that you've been doing that for so long. You're used to that safety blanket and you might not really actually need it.
Yeah. Maybe to throw out another personal example, and, I have a lot of reanimation stuff in my decks is going to be the moral of this story here, but I'm learning, I'm trying to be better is also the moral of this story here.
Sure.
As another example, in my Barakos party deck, I started off with a lot of reanimation spells in that deck because I cannot change who I am as a person. And it just felt like a really great way to keep an army of critters around, right? And the whole deck needs to have an army that will, take my opponents down. But over time, I added in a lot more cards that will protect my entire board. Not just a Selfless Spirit and a Teferi's protection, but I also put in a Selfless Glyph Weaver. Galadriel's Dismissal came out. Plus, I got some new creatures like Aven Interrupter to counter someone's board wipe and buy me another turn, or a Ratadravik, which was on creature type, on theme, and it could copy my legends if they would die. which then meant that my 5+ reanimation spells were basically never needed anymore. So I still have like a couple in there in case of emergency, but I did have to scale that down because they no longer were serving the purpose that they originally did in helping me keep my stuff around. I now had other cards fulfilling that role. So I had to learn to not love the necromancy quite as much in that deck as I do in all of my other decks, which again, hard shift.
It's just such a gradual thing sometimes with those decks too, where you have 7 or 8 cards in a deck that that interacts with something, and then you swap one of them out for this new cool upgrade, and then you swap one out 3 weeks later, and then like 3 months later, and suddenly you've gone from 8 cards that utilize it to 4. And once in a while, that maybe interaction comes up, but like it's much less likely to work the way it once did when you had so many pieces that interacted with it 4 years ago or something. My version of something similar to that, in my Tavash Gloom Summoner deck, mono black deck built around like gaining life, and I use that life to make a zombie, make a giant demon. The deck originally had kind of a big mana sub-theme like you sometimes get in mono black, a lot of mana doublers, the Crypt Gas of the world, Gauntlet of Power, that kind of thing. And then as a result, a lot of the things that gained me life were the big X mana black gain life spells like Drain Life or Consume Spirit that cost, 1 in a black and then X. And then oftentimes I could pump, 15 or 20 mana into that X with the mana doublers or doubling cube, that kind of thing. But over the years, I had kind of phased out a lot of those mana doublers for other cool things, but just because it wound up not being that great of a strategy to, pour everything into this one big spell and then have to spend that life just to make a big demon. Particularly when something like Blood Tithe, a card where each opponent loses 3 life and you gain life, you go to the life loss this way. Well, for 4 mana, I'm getting 9 life. That's way more efficient in most situations than like hoping I can get to the point where I can make 15 life on a Drain Life. So I've pulled out a lot of those doublers over the years, but I still had a lot of those X spells in the deck. And like you said, like you mentioned, as you just removed a few of the doublers, then I got to the point where I had a ton of mana less and less often, and the Drain Lives I was casting were less and less effective. But I hadn't adjusted for that, so I had to like at some point go through and be like, oh, I need to pull out some of these big X spells because I'm not able to produce enough mana to justify them as often as I once was.
Dana, I don't mean to tell you how to play your own decks, but you should put the mana doublers back in there and focus more on that because that's more fun to me.
Sure, yeah, maybe, yes. Right, I mean, that's actually a good point because sometimes the inefficient thing is more fun, right? I'm not going to disagree with that, like absolutely.
And that's just it, right? I mean, like, I'm totally camping up there. That is much more a matter of preference and style. And you have a very specific mission with that deck. And it seems like this other area to go to was going to serve that mission. And maybe it turned out it didn't quite as often as you had hoped or expected it to do.
Yeah.
For me, when I play mono black, I'm addicted to the Cabal Coffers-y type of stuff. So again, there are some things I cannot help. That is one of them.
There's still an Arcana Revenant in the deck. There's still a Crypt Gas. I mean, I still have a couple of them. I just don't have as many as I once did.
Yes, yeah. And it is a thing that you can reduce. And I think that's an important lesson for us to note about this idea of vestigial cards. It isn't like the entire category is going to be gone away with. I think it is just a testament to how competitive card slots are getting.
Yes.
And where maybe you had 5 versions of an effect, now actually 2 is pretty good for you. 2 kind of serves the backup situation that you need, or it gets you to the place you want to go, because there are a lot of other things that are demanding your attention too, in different ways. And so, yeah, I do feel you on that. This is a style. It's a road that I cannot follow you down, but then again, I go down a whole lot of roads that you cannot follow me down. So like, who am I to judge? So.
We all blaze our own path.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a similar thing occurred with a friend of mine. I had a deck he played frequently that had a Dryad Arbor in it, and it never felt like it really did very much. And then like the first time a board wipe would come down, it would get killed, and he'd be down a land. And at some point after this happened multiple times, I asked him, "Why is the Dryad Arbor in your deck? Usually that's a pretty specific card, and I don't see that your deck is doing anything that really interacts with it. I'm just wondering why you have it." He's like, "Well, I used to like to have it as a turn 1 ramp spell because I would cast Green Sun Zenith to go get it. Green Sun Zenith for 0 to go get it as an early ramp. I was like, I've never seen you do that. And like, he's like, yeah, it just hasn't came up. And similar to my crop rotation story, like 2 weeks later, he's like, I checked my deck. I took Green Sun Zenith out at some point and forgot. I took it out.
Oh no!
Yeah, so that, I mean, it's not just me. That's a thing that sometimes happens. So I would say, listeners, check your deck.
Yeah,
that might be a situation where you found that you had a real specific interaction that 2 cards and one of the cards is now gone, and you still have the other half in the deck, not doing very much.
And honestly, how common is it that we take like, oh, you know what? I've only got 1 copy of this card. Maybe it's kind of a rare thing or it's expensive. So I'll put it in this other deck that I just built because I think I could use it a little bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are threads still connected to it. We've done episodes before about the ripple effects, the domino effects that happen. Just removing 1 card sometimes isn't just removing 1 card. So that's a fantastic example. And it can sneak up on you. It can be easy to miss sometimes.
Yeah.
Another personal example that I'll throw out here actually came to me with a partner deck. And this one was, I think, easier to notice than it might be in some other places because I did have 2 commanders. And in this case, the vestigial thing that occurred was because I shifted focus from one of the partners to the other partner. So that actually did make this a little bit more obvious in retrospect. It made it easier to kind of notice. And folks might identify with that out there. This particular example was with my 6th Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith deck. The 6th Doctor is really, really cool. Originally, my build was actually based off of him because as a payoff, he copies the historic spells that you cast and makes them non-legendary. And that's a really, really cool payoff. And when I was doing a whole lot of copying creature tokens based off of the 6 Doctors effect, populate effects such as Sundering Growth were clutch in that deck.
Sure.
Over time, though, I shifted that deck, not focusing quite as much on him as the primary plan. He's now a payoff, but not the center of attention. And I now care a whole lot more about Sarah Jane, who makes a lot of clue tokens when you cast historic spells. And then those clues serve as fodder for cards like Rise and Shine to animate them all and destroy my opponents that way. Or they are extra artifacts in play to pump up my cards like Bronze Guardian. So then as a result, I have a lot less creature tokens in play. And so those populate effects like Sundering Growth are no longer reliable at populating a creature token because I don't have a whole lot of creature tokens. So I wound up eventually replacing it with just a historic spell that also destroys artifacts and enchantments, like Lorna the Third Path, Haywire Might, that sort of thing, that allows me to get clues off of Sarah Jane Smith in the first place. So that's what I wound up replacing that card and those types of cards with. But it was hard to part with Sundering Growth because I was still so attached to how it works with the 6th Doctor. And I needed to remind myself that I had shifted balance from one commander to the other. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of an awakening for me that I also had to have. I'm like, oh, this card is great, because it is. It's a great card when you're making a lot of creature tokens, which I wasn't anymore because I had shifted my attention a little bit.
Sure.
And that's a lesson I had to learn, in this case, kind of a hard way.
I have one final example here, and it's kind of almost like the inverse of this to a degree. So I have a Wizards deck, Veil, Candlekeep, Sage, and when I first built the deck, there was like 30 wizards in the deck, but I was tinkering around with playing it with no instants or sorceries. I thought, okay, I will just use, because a lot of the creatures that come into play that have a counterspell attached to the creature body with flash are wizards. I'm like, okay, maybe I'll just try to play it this way with using wizards for counterspells and for my interaction. As a result, I didn't put the card Neru Miha, Master Wizard, in my deck. It's a 2 and double blue with flash. When it comes into play, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, and then other wizards you control get +1/+1. I didn't want to put it in the deck because, half the card's not useful. I have no instant or sorcery spells in that deck.
Quite a restriction.
Yeah. But I built my Caliphate deck roughly around the same time and realized pretty quickly that that deck would make more sense if I want to try something with no instant or sorceries because it cares about devotion. I'll do that, and I'll actually put instant sorceries back into Veil. But at that point, I'd already not put Neru Maha in that deck. Mm-hmm. And for probably 2 years, it sat there with me playing it with a card that would have been quite useful in that list because those wizards are swinging in, so +1/+1 is something. My commander in that deck does care about her power and toughness in terms of how much mana she makes. Just copying a rapid hybridization or something is very, very useful. But I wasn't running the card because when I had first brewed the list, it wasn't going to do the things I thought it was going to be doing, and then I changed the deck. But hadn't gone back through and reevaluated the original wizards I'd put in it. So I was not running a card that would be probably quite useful in the list because my original vision was with no instant or sorcery spells.
This is this is so funny. It's almost like, I don't want to say reverse vestigial necessarily, but I think there's kind of an inverse relationship to notice here. We've talked about a lot of cards that we kind of take for granted as they've always been in the deck, and therefore we kind of, they go into our peripheral vision rather than being something that we like view objectively.
Sure.
And that can also be true of our maybe boards, and that's really messing me up a whole lot right now, Dana. This card's always been in my maybe board, therefore I'm always secretly mentally discounting it in the back of my mind, when really having a more objective approach could be useful. So I guess I'll use this as a moment to refer folks back to our Take Your Decks Apart episode, where like that's one of the benefits that can happen if you do actually deconstruct a deck and you don't have those biases, those momentum biases playing it into it anymore. Quite a lesson.
Like perhaps you're running cards you shouldn't be running anymore because your deck has changed, but perhaps cards you weren't running, you can be running now because your deck has also changed.
Yeah. Dana, this has been a really cool episode. I really like a lot of these examples, and it is nice to notice the ways that our brains play tricks on us.
Yes, absolutely. No, for sure. Absolutely.
Like,
and how the longer you play the game, the more tricks there are that can play.
Yes.
Like a lot of these wouldn't be problems, I think, for people that have been playing for the last 6 months. But when you've been playing a long time, like you get maybe in routines or habits or patterns or thinking a certain way, and you have to like be ready to challenge those assumptions.
Yeah, it's really fun to play a game that is smarter than you.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been really cool. Listeners, you got to tell us about any examples that you have of cards that you have outgrown or no longer need, and what helped you find which cards those were. But for now, Dana, I think we're going to call this episode to a close. So where is it that listeners can get in touch with us online?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm usually on Blue Sky these days. I write articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And you can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky, at Joseph M. Schultz. And remember to keep an eye on the Dragon Shield site. Click the link in the description of the episode for our new custom EDHRECast sleeves. And of course, you can find the cast online at EDHRECast everywhere. Plus, if you got a question for us, perhaps a challenge the stats submission that you'd like to let us know about, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.